Hello, my name is Ruth D'Hollander, and I thank you, the Machosen Learning Group, for inviting me. I'm grateful to be on this beautiful land of the Chiyeno Nation, and I respectfully acknowledge the ancestors of the Chiyeno people, raise my hands, giving thanks to the people today for sharing their traditional territory. I applaud the work of the Chiyeno people in their commitment to ocean cleanup that I've been reading about, and I hope that the development at Spirit Bay is working well. I have fond memories of time spent here in Machosen going back as far as the 50s. When I came from England to Esquimalt in 1951 as I was entering high school, I met my good friend Daphne, whose parents owned the chicken farm on the property of where my chosen cafe is today. And I was asked to speak about Indigenous language revitalization. When I was asked, my first reaction was to say, I can't do that. It's a huge topic. I can only tell you what I have been involved with. And so here I am. But first, some background of how I got here. I left Victoria in 1959 and only moved back in 2003. Soon after I got here, I joined the faith-based organization Aboriginal Neighbours. It was started by the Anglican Church on Vancouver Island in 1996 and later formed a coalition with United Church of Canada, the Victoria Presbytery at that time, and the Religious Society of Friends, the Quakers. Its mandate has been to build bridges of respect and understanding between cultures through education and interaction. And we're grateful to Victor Newman, whom some of you will know, for creating this logo and supporting our work over the years. When I first joined Aboriginal Neighbours, I was impressed and awed by the knowledge of many of its members about First Nations issues, by their ability to articulate their concerns, and their willingness to work towards achieving right relationship with First Nations. I soon realized that these members were out in the community, meeting First Nations at whatever opportunity arose. They would bring back concerns that they had heard about, and we would discuss what we might do. And the first step was always to go talk with them, to ask if there was something that they would like us to do. This became easier when an Indigenous person attended our meeting. Only when we had a clear indication of a need expressed by an Indigenous group would we take action. Although I had feelings around injustices towards First Nations, I didn't have enough facts to be able to speak out. I was too ignorant to express opinions. Then I started to take part in organizing of events around some of these issues, such as the one Dr. Martin Brokenleg led in Campbell River entitled Healthy Children, Healthy Communities. We arranged some events around the dysfunctional BC treaty process, one at the University of Victoria and this one in Duncan. It was a day-long event in which Indigenous negotiators told their side of the story. In 2007, we were asked to develop a 10-session course at the Lay School of Theology, featuring First Nations presenters on relationships between First Nations people and Canada's settling peoples. Evelyn Voyager gave the first 3 sessions about First Nations life prior to contact. It included topics of missing women, the Indian Act, and the spirituality of First Nations art. For several years, Aboriginal Neighbours took the Kairos blanket exercise to groups willing to participate in the experiential expose of Canadian and BC history in relation to Indigenous people. At the suggestion of the late Frida Shaughnessy, who often attended our meetings, we also helped organize the T-Bird Soccer Fun Day. For 3 years in a row we did that. This was a step on the journey of reconciliation through sport. It started with a traditional parade with Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And the soccer teams were made up of clergy, lay people, Indigenous people, non-Indigenous people. It was a fun day, lots of fun activities. And the Department of National Defense donated their soccer field, their tents, porta potties for the day, and the firemen came along and gave out freezies and sprayed the children or anyone who wanted to cool down that day. The superheroes also volunteered their addition to the fun. And I have to show you this one of the youngest team member. You just can't miss out that one. It was a memorable day and fun for all those involved. So this is just a small sample of activities to give you a flavor of what Aboriginal Neighbours has been about. It was in 2008 that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission began its work across Canada to document the history and lasting impacts of the Canadian Indian residential school system on Indigenous children and their families, and to lead the way to a renewed sense of Canada that is inclusive and respectful and that enables reconciliation. The hearings that took place over 6 years took place in national events in major cities, at regional events, and local community events. These hearings provided those affected by the legacy of the residential schools with an opportunity to share their stories and experiences, and for listeners to hear the truth of what happened in those schools. In 2010, Aboriginal Neighbours, with the amazing coaching of Chief Bobby Joseph, planned a Truth and Reconciliation community event called Open Hearts, Clear Minds. It took place at the First Peoples House at the University of Victoria in December that year. This event brought together survivors of Indian residential schools and their families, along with members of the 4 church denominations on Vancouver Island that ran those schools. The event was at capacity with 300 people. At this gathering, I was stunned by what I was learning about Indian residential schools and the multi-generational impact that they have had and continue to have. I heard firsthand the testimony of men and women who had been badly abused in many ways, who had been beaten as children for using their mother tongue, who were told their language was worthless and were shamed into believing their culture was no good. I was overwhelmed when thinking of the quiet in all those communities without children, of the parents, some who went years without seeing their children, some of whom never saw their children again, never knowing what happened to them. I think of the heartbreak when those children who did return didn't know how to speak to their parents, who were made to feel ashamed of their families. And I was overwhelmed to find out that this had gone on for generations, and to know that this is a cause of the situation we're in today. My shame and indignation grew as I became more aware. And eventually I began to feel I could speak up to present a case for why we in the churches who had run the residential schools needed to learn very quickly that the status quo of injustices was and is still not acceptable. I learned that we have so much to learn about and from our history with First Peoples, and how we can be walking alongside them, equals in the eyes of Creator, but unequal in the amount and kinds of trauma experienced. I will be traveling this learning journey for the rest of my days. Then came the Truth and Reconciliation regional hearings in Victoria in 2012. I was the Anglican representative on the planning committee for this event. Over 2,000 people attended and heard survivors of the schools tell their stories. We heard the ones who were willing to speak in public hearings, which were recorded for history and were heard in packed halls of the general public. At the same time, many other survivors had their experiences recorded for history in private hearing rooms. The following year, 2013, a Truth and Reconciliation national hearing took place in Vancouver. What an impressive day that was in September 2013, in which the canoe arrivals ceremony made its resurgence. The ceremony, rich in symbolism and tradition, lasted many hours as the 6 flotillas, each with 6 to 10 canoes, paddled up to the shoreline at Falls Creek to address the host First Nation on land. Each canoe requested permission to come ashore and listened for the reply. I will always remember Justice Murray Sinclair declaring from his canoe that reconciliation was not just for Indigenous people, but for the whole of Canada. His statement echoed throughout Falls Creek that day and has echoed throughout Canada since then. During the hearings, I was heart-stricken listening to more stories of the atrocious abuse, of the degradation that the survivors who were willing and able to speak recounted. A question was building up in my mind. Why did so many people, First Nations people, hide what had happened to them and talk about feeling ashamed? I was puzzled. Why did they feel shame at what had happened to them? What about all those other feelings I was expecting to hear about? When I asked a dear Indigenous friend about this, her answer was, when you walk into your classroom every single day and you're told by the religious person teaching you that your language, your culture, your family, your everything was no good, you absorb that. And that is what you become, ashamed. And it is this feeling of shame that the Mentor Apprentice program is helping the elders to overcome. The morning after the hearings were over, the Walk for Reconciliation took place. As fine the weather was for the canoe arrivals and the 3-day of hearings, the day of the walk was torrential rain. There were many meaningful ceremonies that preceded the actual walk, but you can be sure that however wet we got, spirits were not dampened. The work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission closed in June 2015. It completed its report in December that year and produced 94 calls to action. These calls of action are directed to all levels of government and all sections of Canadian life to redress the legacy of residential schools and to advance the process of Canadian reconciliation. The 94 calls to action are meant to aid the healing process in 2 ways. Acknowledging the full horrifying history of the residential school system and creating systems to prevent these abuses from ever happening again in the future. I was privileged to be with Janet Gray and members of Kairos on June the 2nd, 2016, when all 94 calls to action were read in turn by 22 Indigenous and non-Indigenous dignitaries from the steps of the BC legislature. So let me go back to a February evening in 2015, the evening of International Mother Language Day. I attended a panel discussion at the Royal BC Museum in the area of the exhibit called Our Living Languages, First Peoples' Voices in British Columbia. BC is home to 34 unique First Nations languages, which make up 60% of Canada's Indigenous languages. Many of these languages also have several diverse dialects. All of BC's Indigenous languages remain endangered because of the destructive policies of the Indian residential school system. I listened to the panelists tell about the work being done to awaken and revitalize their Indigenous languages throughout the province. I heard about dedicated hard work and the passionate striving against time to reclaim endangered languages, cultures, and arts. And as I listened, I realized the speakers and the backup personnel who were present were all Indigenous people working very hard against so many odds to rectify what my government, my church, had done to them, intentionally destroying their language, their culture, and their identity. By then, I was well aware of the residential schools and colonialism that had caused this tragic situation. But that evening, as I listened to what was happening around the province among First Nations, I was hit hard by the injustice of the rest of us sitting by while the First Nations themselves were struggling on their own to rectify the damage done to them. I wondered what I could do to get an equal amount of passion engendered amongst church people and the general population to provide some reparation for this appalling situation for which we were responsible. During question period, I asked, if you could wave a magic wand to help you cope with your most pressing demand, what would you ask for? Without missing a beat, one panel member, Dr. Lorna Williams, said that people learn, understand, and tell about what has happened and is happening with our languages. A second panelist, Dr. Peter Jacobs, immediately followed with support for the Mentor Apprentice program. I had my answer, I had my focus, and I knew how education would be essential, but I had no idea what form support for Mentor Apprentice programs would take. It wasn't the moment to go into such detail, but I soon set out to get myself some help to journey on this road of reparation. Shortly after, I found out that I needed to talk to the folk at the First Peoples Cultural Council. Lorna Williams introduced me to Tracy Herbert, its executive director, who told me about $50,000 was needed to support one teaching learning team over a 3-year period. Multiply that by all the teams needed, and we were looking at a lot of money. Soon afterwards, I talked with my colleagues and Aboriginal neighbors about the need to support the revitalization of Indigenous languages, focusing on the Mentor Apprentice program and taking place on Vancouver Island. They signed up to setting up a special interest group for this project, and we called it RILL, Revitalization of Indigenous Living Languages, a gift to future generations. We knew that to be raising large amounts of money would require special involvement of the Anglican diocese here. Our request was taken to a governing group which endorsed the project and immediately allocated some funds for it. I met with the First Peoples Cultural Council, who agreed to become the managing partner of the project, thus ensuring that it would be community controlled in accordance with the Call to Action number 61, Section 2. And I read, Call to Action number 61 states, we call upon church parties to the settlement agreement in collaboration with survivors and representatives of Aboriginal organizations to establish permanent funding to Aboriginal people for, and Section 2, community-controlled culture and language revitalization projects. RILL could not promise permanent funding, but we could certainly do our best to raise funds, and that is what we set out to do. The grant seeking and fundraising process began. Besides a local diocesan grant, we applied to and obtained funds from the National Anglican Healing Fund and Anglican Foundation, and the Victoria and Vancouver Foundations, and we partnered with Bema Productions from the Synagogue Congregation Emmanuel, who shared the proceeds of a production of John Lazarus's play, The Grandkid. And some parish churches did their own fundraising, all of which not only provided dollars and cents for language revitalization, but also increased knowledge of the urgency behind the cause. Within the year, we had enough funds for one mentor-apprentice team to be involved for the 3-year program. At first, I had hopes that this project would evolve into relationship building between members of the local parishes and the First Nations community in which the mentor-apprentice teams were involved. But my advisors in the First Peoples Cultural Council soon enlightened me that this was unlikely to happen. So sensitive was the teaching-learning environment and how negatively many of the First Peoples perceived the church. Of course, how naive of me to think otherwise. For some of those receiving grants, they would first have to forgive what was done to them before grants could be accepted. It soon became apparent to me that this project, this gesture of reparation and reconciliation on the part of church members and the general population, would primarily involve fundraising for Indigenous language instruction, while educating non-Indigenous people about the urgency for it, that expectations of relationship building would be on the back burner while damage repair was taking place. The need for mentor-apprentice programs was urgent, as many fluent language speakers were dying. In the spring of 2016, the First Peoples Cultural Council received 55 applications for mentor-apprentice teams. I was told that it was able to fund just 10 of those requests, 3 of which would come from our RILL project if the resources allocated by Aboriginal neighbors could be used up front to fund 3 teams that year, hoping that additional funds would come in to enable them to continue for the following 2 years. The following year, 2016 to 2017, the First Peoples Cultural Council received new applications from 56 teams, but was only able to support 14 of them. We were facing a state of emergency as elders were dying, resulting in the loss of a large percentage of First Nations traditional languages, culture, and worldview. So what is the Mentor-Apprentice Program? This program was originally developed in California. In 2008, the First Peoples Cultural Council brought it to BC, where it has proven to be an effective immersion learning model. It is well monitored, researched, and evaluated. It was first called the Master Apprentice Program, but that was changed to the less colonial tone of Mentor Apprentice. The Mentor Apprentice Program addresses long-term impacts of residential schools by reconnecting intergenerational relationships and connecting language learners to the cultural wisdom of the community. This immersion approach to language teaching and learning involves a fluent speaking elder teaching an adult learner his or her mother language, along with its cultural and spiritual knowledge. In the original model, the teacher and learner committed to spending 300 hours a year for 3 years, working together in full immersion in their Indigenous language, doing activities that the team has selected as being relevant and useful. Language is learned in context. The language learners, the apprentices, are expected to become the teachers of the next generation of both their language as well as their rich culture. Some are able to fill leadership roles as they grow in knowledge, expertise, and confidence. Recently, the program has added 2 other options, the adaptations made in order to be more flexible to the needs of learners and to the COVID-19 situation. The online training that was developed during COVID has proven to be a very effective adjunct to the in-person sessions. For apprentices, the program delivers measurable results in terms of increased language proficiency. As a graduate of the program, the apprentices are expected to pass on their learning to the next generation. The apprentices are responsible for administering their own learning program with the support of the First Peoples Cultural Council. With their mentor, they set their learning goals for each 100-hour period, and at the end of the 100 hours, the apprentices have to arrange their evaluation sessions with 3 fluent speaking elders. Goals might include improving specific components of grammar, targeted vocabulary for topics of interest, pronunciation, sentence structure, all within the context of the immersion experience. Learning goals could be learning the language around topics ranging from everyday chores and daily greetings and conversations to language around food gathering, food preparation, fishing, hunting, plant knowledge, as well as more complex and culturally entwined topics such as origin stories and cultural legends. Many apprentices report their learning is transformational for them. Learning their ancestral language opens new ways of seeing the world, as well as a deeper understanding of their personal, family, and community histories. All this leads to a positive sense of self-worth. As many program activities take place outdoors, the program also strengthens apprentices' connections to the land. For mentors, the program can be an emotional experience, both positive and negative. Having new opportunities to speak their languages in their communities with recognition for their knowledge and ability, it's positive. But for those who are residential school survivors and who were ridiculed and punished for speaking their language as if they had committed a crime, it can bring out negative feelings. I was told of one mentor who, when beginning the program, had to overcome deep feelings of shame and fear which had been buried deep and which surfaced during the early sessions with her apprentice. Many elders became the silent speakers who understand and can speak the language but do not because of fear that it will bring harm, that anyone speaking their mother tongue will be punished. The recognition of being a mentor in this program adds to their confidence in speaking their language again. These elders are enabled to practice and use their language in ways which honor traditional cultural and spiritual practices that had been forbidden. They report that they find a sense of pride, of wholeness, and of hope as they teach their apprentices, and this can lead to their healing. The financial support that team members receive helps to mitigate the constraints and challenges of the intense immersion experiences added on to work, family, and community commitments, as well as time spent on preparation and practice. After each evaluation period, the apprentice sends the reports and a summary of their learning to the First Peoples Cultural Council. It is only after this period of 100 hours of teaching learning that the team members receive their stipends. The elders assembled for the evaluation session, of which there are 3 in 1 year's work, are also paid an honorarium after each session. A small amount of the funding for the program covers administration costs such as the selection and training of teams, providing materials, technology, and ongoing support throughout the program. We, as grant writers, have to turn in progress reports to our donors. We gather the information for these from the First Peoples Cultural Council. And we're happy when we can tell of successes, of the intrinsic satisfaction of the learners, their increased confidence and comfort using the language, and of the encouragement they get from the evaluation panelists, such as, "Your vocabulary has increased. You are telling stories our way and staying true to traditional ways of speaking. You are really learning our language, and even you're teaching us." This positive feedback reinforces the range of skills that the apprentice has been working on. Some apprentices have created songs, prayers, and have learned nature terms and ceremonial language. One reported she had achieved her short-term goal of speaking her language for at least an hour. She also shared that she had begun to dream in her language. We rejoice when we hear such comments as, "This year has been a dream come true, something I've been aching to do for many years, and working on my language was always a highlight of my week." Through the reporting process, we also learned of the challenges the teams have been facing, some more than others, some being health challenges with hospital stays and, sadly, some deaths. Some have overwhelming schedules in their jobs as teachers and community members. A big challenge for some apprentices is in improving pronunciation of certain sounds that are not in English. I, for one, can relate to this obstacle. As apprentices' language skills improve, they report being excited to share their knowledge. They become in demand as teachers in schools, to family members, and at community events. So the support of this program contributes not just to one adult language learner, but to many others wanting to learn the language and to a renewed sense of pride in the ancestral language in the wider community. On a personal note, in 2018, I needed to step back from the grant writing work, and I'm grateful to Sarah Kell for taking over this task and for doing it so willingly and so well. Since our RILL project started in 2015, a lot of positive actions have taken place to make reparation for the loss of languages and identity that the Indigenous people of Canada have suffered. At the federal level, language legislation was enacted in Bill C-91 in 2019, making a commitment of federal and provincial governments to fund Indigenous language programs. While this federal legislation was being worked on, the BC government in 2018 allocated a $50 million grant to the First Peoples Cultural Council for Indigenous language revitalization in this province. This was a one-time investment to increase the number of fluent speakers and gave the organization the ability to shift from annual grants to those with longer terms. And recently, First Peoples Cultural Council have developed a course for silent speakers, a great option for communities in the early stages of language revitalization. I'm pleased to report that the Mentor Apprentice programs are filled to capacity, that no team is turned away these days, thanks to government funding. Unfortunately, the work done by First Peoples Cultural Council in the arts and cultural heritage are not so well supported. At this point, I want to show you a short video made by one of the apprentices, especially for the RILL program.
Tlayahuas, uklasis tlaukis taxus tlauquet, hisa quistas mahti ihazat, umatsukma sasaku mentor apprentice, ka pups, ni mentor apprentice. Happy to see you. My name's Giselle from Tla'ukwit, and I had the amazing privilege to do the Mentor Apprentice program through First Peoples Cultural Council for 3 years. I had begun learning my language in 2010, I think, and I had gotten stuck studying by myself and only knowing a few one-sentence words. One words actually at a time, no sentences. I was feeling like I plateaued and really looking for a way to learn more. And that didn't happen until I finally got in the Mentor Apprentice program with my mentor Levi Martin Kamat from Tla'ukwit, and we began doing immersion for sometimes 6 hours a day, which was pretty overwhelming at times, but just so enriching. It's really, language has expanded my identity, and I feel like my cultural awareness in ways I never expected. It's given me access to so much more feeling and knowledge about our identity as Tla'ukwit and Nuu-chah-nulth people, and just strength to be able to speak with a lot more confidence about who we are. I'm still learning, and I always will be, but I'm so grateful to have had this opportunity with First Peoples Cultural Council. When we began practicing, there's a lot of new words that came out, and some of them, just the concepts of them really changed my life. Aphae is a word meaning to be friendly, but it also means to be able to ask for help when you need it. So you can't be friendly unless you're able to ask for help. And that one word really changed my life, because I thought that I was a friendly person, but I was terrible at asking for help. So it caused me to have more awareness about it and to decide to be better at asking for help. And that really shifted my relationships and my personal life in a lot of ways. There's a lot of other words that I also learned that are just all around cool, and even just regular words like suchas, the word for tree. All the words are verb based in our language, and so the names of plants, animals, and chairs and things are named for the verbs surrounding them and how they're connected in relationship to the rest of the universe. And the word for tree is suchas, and it doesn't just mean tree, it's the name of tree, but suchas comes from suchit, which is to hold, and us is the suffix ending meaning like on the land. So suchas, landholder, literally is the name for tree. Su in Tsakakukin, let us hold on to our language. So our language is ecologically informed, rooted, and it's so important for us to hold on to here, especially in Plaokwe Tribal Park. There's been so much effort to protect the lands and the waters of this place over thousands of generations, but also in recent decades and centuries with colonialism. The land, the culture, the language are completely interconnected, and if we can protect our language, it helps to protect the land, and vice versa. There's some places where we may not have the words, the place names, the traditional place names for them anymore, but if those places are protected, we can relearn what their names are through our language, through the land itself, because places and things are named for what they do. So I'm just super grateful for Mentor Apprentice, and I hope more people can do it. I'm so happy my sister got accepted into the program, and her and I can practice language now. Sometimes I crash her and Levi Martin's Mentor Apprentice sessions, and it's so fun to be able to joke around with my little sister and Levi and have the three of us speaking, because sometimes the pressure's on and I get really worried that I'm going to be the last speaker. So I'm really stoked when I see my sister speaking and learning, and other youth in our community as well, and there's definitely a growing interest. And it's not just New Channel, it's all the conferences and places I go where I meet other people, and you can see that inspiration and that longing in our hearts to know our language, to be reconnected with our roots and our worldview, to be able to see the world in that color. So Tleiko, thank you very, very much for this opportunity. Choo.
When I started this work, the Mentor Apprentice program was singled out by the Indigenous leaders in language revitalization as needing special support, and it enabled Aboriginal neighbors to respond to one call to action in a spirit of reconciliation and right relationship, hopefully healing and reconnecting intergenerational relationships within communities that were broken by the residential school system. We couldn't have done anything on this journey of reconciliation without the First Peoples Cultural Council. I want to congratulate this organization for the superb work it has been doing for a very long time and continues to do to revitalize Indigenous languages, arts, and cultural heritage within British Columbia. Its work has been groundbreaking and has gained widespread recognition throughout Canada and beyond. I really encourage you to take a look at the First Peoples Cultural Council website and to be prepared to spend lots of time on it. Take a look at its timeline of activities, its involvement in technology, its role in developing Indigenous language legislation, Bill C-91, the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, and especially its interactive map, which will explain the richness of Indigenous languages and culture in British Columbia, and will help you with the pronunciation of Indigenous names. As Chief Bobby Joseph, one of the founders of the Indian Residential School Survivors Society and of Reconciliation Canada, has taught us, it will be by one conversation at a time, one step at a time, that will bring reconciliation between non-Indigenous and Indigenous people in this country. The RILL project is just one very small step in the journey of reconciliation. Thank you for listening, and I wish you well, and I especially wish the Chinook Nation success in welcoming their people home.